It was late October when I decided to rent a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of Northumberland, England. I had spent the past few years working long hours in the city, and I needed a break, somewhere quiet, away from the constant noise and stress. I wasn't much of a hunter, but I liked the idea of solitude. Just me, the trees, and maybe a few nights by the fire with a book. The cabin was old, built in the early 1900s, but well kept. It sat near the edge of a dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. It was perfect. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, but I found it comforting. I had brought enough supplies to last a week, including a rifle I borrowed from a friend, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out here you never knew. The second night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. It wasn't the wind this time. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps crunching on dead leaves. I sat up in bed, listening, my heart hammering. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, moving closer. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight as I listened. Then, nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin. Eventually, I lay back down, forcing myself to sleep. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human ones. They led from the trees to the cabin and stopped just below my bedroom window. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been standing there, watching me while I slept. I spent the rest of the day uneasy, trying to push the thought away. Maybe it was another hunter who got lost, I told myself. Maybe they were just curious about the cabin. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong about those footprints, something intentional. That night, I locked the doors and windows, double-checking every latch. I kept the rifle next to me as I lay in bed, listening for any sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps outside. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Then came a soft scratching sound against the wooden door, like fingernails dragging across the surface. I stayed frozen in place, too afraid to move. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, then suddenly stopped. I waited, my ears straining. Then I heard it breathing, heavy, slow breathing, just on the other side of the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When I finally built up the courage to check outside, my stomach twisted. There were fresh footprints leading around the cabin, circling it over and over. Someone had been pacing, watching, waiting. I wanted to leave, but part of me felt stupid. Maybe it was just some local messing with me, knowing I was alone out here. I tried to shake it off, but my gut told me otherwise. The next day, I took a long walk through the woods, hoping to clear my head. The autumn leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the cool air felt good. I wandered for hours, until I came across something that made my blood run cold. A small clearing hidden deep in the woods. In the center, an old wooden chair sat beneath a tree. Around it, the ground was covered in bones, animal bones, but some looked different. Too long, too thin. Human? I wasn't sure. My heart pounded as I scanned the area. Whoever had been circling my cabin had spent time here. Then, I noticed something that made my hands shake. A rope dangled from the tree above the chair, tied into a noose. And next to the chair, something carved into the tree trunk. "I see you." I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, locking the door behind me. I had seen enough. I needed to get out of there. That night, I sat in the dark, waiting. The rifle was in my hands, my bags packed. I planned to leave at first light, but around 3 a.m., the footsteps came back. Slow, purposeful. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They went around the cabin, circling over and over. Then, a soft tapping on the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping came again, slow and rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. I tightened my grip on the rifle, staring at the window. The tapping stopped. Then, in the silence, I heard it again, that breathing. Heavy, labored, right outside the glass. The sun couldn't come fast enough. As soon as it was light, I threw my bag over my shoulder, grabbed the rifle, and ran to my truck. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a man. Tall, thin, dressed in tattered clothes. His face was pale, eyes dark, sunken. He just stood there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally got back to town, I told the cabin owner what had happened. He went quiet, then shook his head. "You're not the first," he said. "That's why no one rents it for long. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those woods again." I had been staying in a remote cabin in France for about a week when it happened. I had planned the trip as a way to get away from the city, away from work, and just be alone for a while. I wasn't the kind of person who liked crowds, and the idea of a quiet week in the woods sounded perfect. The cabin was old but well-maintained, sitting in a thick forest about 20 kilometers from the nearest village. It had everything I needed: electricity, running water, a small fireplace to keep warm at night. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking the trails around the cabin, sitting on the porch reading, and listening to the sounds of the forest. The only signs of other people were the occasional distant sounds of hunters or hikers passing through. It was exactly what I had been hoping for: quiet, empty, and calm. But by the fourth night, something changed. I was sitting by the fireplace, reading, when I heard it for the first time. A sound just outside the cabin. It was soft at first, almost like footsteps, but slower and uneven, like someone was limping. I put my book down and listened. The wind was blowing lightly through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it again. A slow, dragging step, followed by another. I stood up and walked to the window. It was pitch black outside. The forest was dense, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, so I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the porch light. I waited, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. I shook my head and laughed at myself. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a wild boar. I had seen plenty of tracks on my hikes. I went back to my chair, but I couldn't focus on my book anymore. Something about the sound had felt wrong. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear something outside. Sometimes it was just the wind, but other times it was that same dragging sound. Slow, deliberate, like something was circling the cabin. By morning, I had convinced myself it was my imagination. The lack of sleep was messing with my head. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch, looking for any signs that something had been there during the night. The ground was damp from a light rain, and there were tracks. But they weren't animal tracks. They were human, sort of. The footprints were large, bigger than my own, and spaced in a way that suggested whoever made them was moving awkwardly. Some of them looked normal, but others had a strange shape, like whoever was walking had suddenly shifted their weight in a way that wasn't natural. And the worst part, some of them ended in deep, claw-like marks. I crouched down and touched one of the prints. The mud was still wet, meaning whatever had made them had been here recently. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but everything was quiet. Something about the tracks sent a deep, uneasy feeling into my chest. I had grown up in the countryside, and I had seen all kinds of animal tracks before, but this wasn't right. It looked human, but it wasn't. I shook my head and forced myself to stop thinking about it. I had probably just misinterpreted the prints. Maybe the rain had messed them up, made them look stranger than they really were. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but something about the forest felt different. It was too quiet. Normally, I would hear birds, rustling leaves, the sounds of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But today there was nothing, just an eerie, empty silence. That night, I locked the doors and closed all the curtains. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I stayed up later than usual, keeping the fire going, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my chest. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The same slow, dragging steps, closer this time. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, my heart pounding. I could hear something moving just outside the cabin, heavy footsteps circling the walls. The wooden boards of the porch creaked. It was on the porch. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, I heard something even worse. A voice. It sounded almost human. Almost. But there was something off about it, something wrong. It was like someone trying to mimic human speech, but getting it just slightly wrong. The cadence was unnatural, the tone hollow. I stayed completely still. I didn't answer. I didn't move toward the door. The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for it to do something. But eventually, the footsteps started again, slow and dragging, moving away from the cabin. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I finally let out a shaky breath. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, waiting for the sound to come back. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to step outside. The porch was covered in more of those strange footprints, circling the cabin over and over again. But what made my blood run cold was the door. There were deep, claw-like scratches along the wood, and next to them, smeared in the damp wood, was a handprint. A handprint with fingers that were too long. I packed my things in less than 5 minutes. I didn't care about the rest of my trip, didn't care about the food I had left in the fridge. I threw everything into my bag, got in my car, and drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the next village. I found a small cafe and sat inside, trying to calm down, telling myself I had imagined things. But when I looked at my car, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Along the driver's side door, in the same strange claw-like marks, was a single word scratched into the metal. Come back. I took the job because I needed the money. It wasn't supposed to be hard, just watching over an old research cabin deep in the woods overnight. Sounded boring, but easy. I was told the place had once been used by some environmental study group back in the 90s, but funding dried up, and now the cabin just sat there, locked up and mostly forgotten. My job was to keep an eye on it. The cabin was miles from anything. It sat in the middle of thick, untamed forest, reachable only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees for miles before connecting to a barely paved highway. The company that owned the land still wanted occasional security checks to keep trespassers away. Hunters, squatters, or whoever might be looking for a free place to stay. They didn't want anyone getting inside, breaking things, or leaving a mess. The first few nights were easy. I would drive out just before sunset, park my truck beside the cabin, and sit inside with a flashlight and a book. There was no electricity, no running water, just an old wood stove, a metal cot, and some shelves filled with dust-covered notebooks. I passed the time listening to the rain tap against the roof and watching the trees sway in the wind. The rain that wouldn't stop on the 4th night. the rain started. It was light at first, just a drizzle, but by the time I reached the cabin, it was pouring. The wind had picked up, shaking the branches above me, making the woods feel restless. The road was already turning to mud, and I had to fight the steering wheel to keep my truck from sliding into the ditches that lined the narrow path. By the time I got inside, my clothes were soaked. The air inside was damp and smelled like old wood and mildew. I left my wet jacket on a hook by the door and checked the locks on the windows like I always did. Everything seemed fine, but something about the rain hitting the roof made the cabin feel different that night. The hours dragged. I sat on the cot, flipping through an old notebook I had found on one of the shelves. It was filled with notes about the wildlife in the area, lists of animal sightings, weather records, and random observations. Some of the pages had been ripped out. At some point, I realized how quiet it was outside. The rain was still falling, but the wind had died down. The trees weren't creaking anymore. Even the usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were gone. I stepped to the window, shining my flashlight out into the trees. Nothing, just sheets of rain falling between the dark trunks. My truck sat a few yards away, the rainwater running off the hood in streams. The forest beyond was just a black void. I sat back down and tried to shake the unease creeping into my gut. It was just a quiet night, I told myself. Nothing unusual. Then I heard it, faint, barely audible over the rain. A noise that didn't belong. Footsteps, not the sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. These were distinct, heavy steps, slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still, listening. The steps came from behind the cabin, somewhere in the trees. Then they stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the rain. Then a soft tap against the back window. My stomach tightened. I turned my flashlight toward the window, but the glass was too fogged up to see outside. I stood up slowly, my pulse hammering. Another tap. I had checked the locks earlier. I knew the window was shut, but the sound was too precise, too intentional. Someone was outside. I reached for my knife, the only weapon I had, and moved as quietly as I could toward the door. My truck was right outside. If I could reach it, I could be gone in seconds. But then something changed. A shadow moved past the window. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the rain. Something was out there. Something was watching. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to act fast. My truck was close, but I had to make it to the door without making too much noise. I moved slow, my boots barely making a sound against the old wooden floor. My hand found the doorknob slick with sweat. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and threw the door open. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the dirt outside into thick mud. My truck was right there, but I hesitated. The trees felt wrong. I didn't see anyone, but the forest felt off. Then I noticed something. The driver's side door of my truck was open. I knew for a fact that I had locked it. I never left it open. My breath caught in my throat. If someone had been outside my window a minute ago, and now my truck was open, they were inside. I gripped my knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, a steady pounding that matched the rain. I had two choices: run back into the cabin and lock the door, or try to make it to the truck and drive out of there. I chose the truck. I moved fast, splashing through the mud, reaching for the handle. Something shifted inside. A shape. I saw it move in the driver's seat, a dark figure. My own reflection barely showed in the rain-slicked window, but I knew I wasn't alone. I acted without thinking. I grabbed the door and yanked it open. Empty. The seat was wet from the rain, but there was no one inside. Just the smell of damp fabric and something else. Something faint but sharp. A smell like sweat and metal. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I didn't have time to think. I shoved the key into the ignition, turned it, and the engine roared to life. My tires spun in the mud as I reversed, kicking up water and dirt. As I turned onto the narrow road, my headlights swept across the trees. And that's when I saw him, a man, standing just beyond the tree line. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes soaked from the rain. His face was pale, almost gray in the headlights. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there watching. Then I noticed something in his hand. Hearing. My spare truck key, the one I kept hidden under the wheel well. He had been inside my truck. He had been waiting. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I tore down that muddy road, my tires barely gripping the slick ground. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the main highway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I drove straight into town and parked under the bright lights of a gas station, my truck still running. I checked the back seat 3 times before I finally let myself breathe. The next morning, I quit. I didn't tell them what happened. I just told them I wasn't coming back. I never figured out who he was. I never found out how long he had been watching me or how he knew I had a spare key. But I think about that night a lot. I think about how I almost got into that truck without checking. And I think about what would have happened if I had. I never thought I'd see my dad's friend, Mike, break down like that. He was always the kind of guy who kept his emotions in check. A cop for over 20 years, built like a brick wall. But that night, when we sat in the living room of my dad's house, he looked like a man who had seen something he wished he could forget. I knew him growing up, but I wasn't close to him. He was just one of my dad's friends, the kind of guy who came over to watch football and drink beer. I knew he had been divorced for a long time, and I knew he had a cabin up in the mountains, but I never paid much attention to his life. Until that night. That night, he told us something I can't shake. Something that made me feel sick in my stomach and question how much we ever really know about the people around us. It started with his ex-wife, Lisa. She had disappeared. Not in the normal way people disappear either. She wasn't running from something, and she hadn't just decided to start over somewhere new. She had gone missing in a way that made no sense. Mike hadn't seen her in years, but they were on okay terms. No kids, no real reason to keep in touch. But they weren't enemies either. One day, out of nowhere, she had called him up and asked if she could stay at his cabin for a while. She sounded different, he said. Desperate, maybe even scared. She didn't explain why, just said she needed somewhere to be alone. Mike had no reason to say no. The cabin wasn't anything special, just a small place in the woods about 3 hours from the city. He barely used it anymore, just went up there now and then to fish or hunt. He told her she could stay as long as she needed. A few weeks passed and he didn't think much of it, until she stopped responding. He had called a few times just to check in, but she never picked up. At first, he figured she just wanted space. But after 2 weeks of silence, something felt off. That's when he decided to drive up there himself. It was late September when he went, the kind of weather where the leaves were starting to turn, and the air had that first real bite of cold. He got up there in the afternoon, expecting to find her inside, maybe sleeping or out on the deck reading. But when he pulled into the driveway, something was wrong. Her car was still there. It was parked right where she would have left it, but something about it felt off. The windows were dirty, like it had been sitting there for a long time. The tires were a little deflated, not flat, but soft, like they had lost air slowly. Mike knocked on the cabin door. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. That's when he got the first real feeling that something wasn't right. The door was locked, but he had a spare key. When he stepped inside, he expected to see some sign that she had been there recently. Dishes in the sink, a half-empty cup of coffee on the table, anything. But the place looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. A layer of dust had started to settle on the counters. The air smelled stale. The strangest thing was that her bags were still there. Her suitcase was open in the bedroom, clothes still folded inside. Her purse was sitting on the nightstand. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, plugged into the charger, but dead. It was like she had just walked out the door one day and never come back. Mike checked every room. The bathroom, the closet, even outside on the porch. Nothing. He walked down the path toward the lake, calling her name. No response. That's when the feeling in his gut turned to something worse. He had been a cop long enough to know what this meant. She hadn't just left. Something had happened to her. Mike spent the next few hours searching. He walked the entire property, checked the small tool shed, even went down to the main road to see if there were any tracks. Nothing. When it got dark, he called the local sheriff's office. They sent out a few guys the next morning, and a full search was launched. They brought out dogs, volunteers, even a helicopter. They found no sign of her. Not in the woods, not in the lake. It was like she had vanished into thin air. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they found in the shed. Mike hadn't thought to check it too closely at first. It was just an old structure, half falling apart, barely used. But when the deputies opened the door, they found something inside. It was a small pile of food wrappers, water bottles, and a sleeping bag. Someone had been living there recently. The thing was, Lisa hadn't mentioned anything about sleeping in the shed. And judging by the state of the cabin, it was clear she had been staying inside, which meant someone else had been there. And whoever it was, they had been close. Mike felt sick when he realized what it meant. Someone had been watching her, living on the property, maybe for days, maybe weeks. Had she known? Had she realized someone was out there? The sheriff's department took it seriously at first, but when no other evidence turned up, the case started to go cold. They found no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. No one in the area had seen anything. After a few months, they labeled it a missing person case. No evidence of foul play, no leads, nothing to go on. Mike kept going back to the cabin, hoping for some kind of clue. He went every weekend for almost a year, but nothing ever changed, until one day when he found something new. It was almost a year later, in the dead of winter. Snow was covering the ground, and the lake was frozen over. Mike had been clearing out some old brush when he saw something sticking out of the ground near the shed. It was a zipper, half buried in the dirt, barely visible. He dug with his hands, pulling it up, and found a jacket. A woman's jacket, Lisa's jacket. It was covered in dirt, frozen stiff, like it had been out there for months. And inside the pocket, there was something else. A key. Not a cabin key, not a car key. A small, rusted key with no markings. Mike didn't know what it opened. He didn't know why it was buried there. But he knew one thing for sure. Lisa never left that cabin. And someone else had been there with her. I never liked the idea of moving to a cabin in the woods, but my husband, Daniel, was drawn to it. He said he wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant rush, and the weight of a job that drained him. I understood that, but something about the deep woods made me uneasy. I liked having neighbors close, people within shouting distance. Out here, all we had were the trees and whatever lived in them. The cabin wasn't new. Daniel had found it for sale at a surprisingly low price, nestled in a thick forest about an hour from the nearest town. It wasn't abandoned, but it had been sitting empty for a few years. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced a stretch of land covered in pines and maples. The first time I saw it, something about it felt off. Not haunted, not cursed, just wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Daniel, on the other hand, was at ease. He knew the place well. I found out later why. The first few months were uneventful. We spent our time fixing up the cabin, clearing out old furniture, repainting, and making it livable. Daniel handled most of the work while I focused on the small garden near the porch. The days were quiet, the nights even quieter. But then things started happening. Small things at first. I would leave something on the kitchen counter, only to find it in a completely different place minutes later. I blamed myself at first, thinking I was just forgetting where I put things. Then there were the noises, soft footsteps outside at night. The first time I heard them, I shook Daniel awake, but by the time he checked, there was nothing there. After the third night of hearing them, I stayed awake and looked out the window. I saw someone, not clearly, just a shadow moving between the trees. I told Daniel and he acted like it was nothing. Probably just an animal, he said, though I noticed he started locking the doors every night after that. I felt watched, no matter where I was, outside tending to the garden, reading on the porch, even inside cooking. I felt eyes on me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I found the photograph. It was in the attic, inside a box that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old letters, yellowed papers, and then her face. A woman, dark hair, sharp features, standing in front of our cabin, smiling at the camera. And beside her, Daniel, younger, but it was him. My hands shook as I flipped the picture over. There was a date, 2007. More than a decade before we moved in. Beneath it, in small, neat handwriting, for Daniel, always. I confronted him that night. His face changed when I showed him the picture. His usual calm expression broke into something I had never seen before. He looked haunted. He told me the truth. Her name was Leah. She was his first love. They had bought this cabin together when they were young, planning to live here forever. But something happened. He didn't say what, just that she was gone. She left, he said. She didn't want this life anymore. But the way he said it didn't feel right. After that night, things got worse. The noises outside turned into scratching at the windows. I woke up to find muddy footprints on the porch, bare feet. And then one evening, just before sunset, I saw her, standing at the tree line, half hidden behind the thick trunks. She wasn't a ghost, wasn't some spirit from the past. She was real, and she was watching me. I called for Daniel, but by the time he came outside, she was gone. Couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured her face from the photograph. I needed answers. The next morning, I went back to the attic. I dug through the old letters, through everything she had left behind. And then I found her journal. The last entry was short. "He won't let me leave. I'm scared." That was it. No date, no details. But I knew what it meant. Daniel hadn't told me the truth. That night, I told him I wanted to leave. His face darkened. "Why?" he asked. I made up excuses, but he saw through them. I saw something in his eyes then, something that made my stomach drop. He wasn't going to let me leave either. I stayed awake while he slept, heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out. I needed to know what happened to Leah. Just before dawn, I grabbed the car keys and went outside. The air was thick, the trees silent. I took one step toward the car, and then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I turned. She was there, closer this time. I saw her face clearly now, pale, sunken, but alive. She wasn't dead. She had never left. Daniel had lied. She took another step, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. I got in the car, started the engine, and slammed my foot on the gas. I didn't stop. Not until I reached town, until I was somewhere safe. I called the police. They searched the cabin, searched the woods. They found her things, but not her. And Daniel? He disappeared. No trace of him. No sign of where he had gone. The police called it a domestic dispute, said he likely fled when he realized I had gone. But I knew better. Somewhere in those woods, Leah was still watching, and so was he. I took a deep breath as I pulled my truck off the narrow road and onto the gravel driveway leading to the cabin. It was late September, and the trees had already started to turn, covering the hills in reds, oranges, and yellows. The air was cool but not cold, and there was the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A break from the noise of work, the constant stress of emails, meetings, and deadlines. Just me, a cabin, and the quiet of nature. The cabin was a rental, one I had found through a small website that listed off-the-grid places for people wanting solitude. It was advertised as an old hunting cabin, deep in a valley, with no electricity, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. Exactly what I wanted. As I parked, I took in the place. It was a one-story wooden cabin, its dark brown logs blending in with the trees. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a set of wooden steps led to the door. There was a stone chimney rising up one side, and beside the cabin, a rusted metal pump stood over a well. The place looked solid but old, like it had been here for decades without much upkeep. I grabbed my bags from the truck and headed inside. The air inside smelled of wood and dust, with a faint scent of something musty, like damp fabric left too long in a closed-up room. The main room had a wood stove, a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, and a couch covered in an old plaid blanket. A small kitchenette was on one side with a counter, a few shelves, and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. A door led to a bedroom with a twin-sized bed, a small wooden dresser, and a single window overlooking the trees. There was another door to the bathroom which had an old porcelain sink, a mirror, and a toilet that, according to the rental instructions, flushed into a septic tank. I set my bags down and went back outside to get some firewood. The owner had said there was a pile behind the cabin, and sure enough, there was a stack of logs, neatly arranged and dry. I grabbed an armful and brought them inside, setting them beside the wood stove. I'd light a fire later when it got colder. I spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. There wasn't much to do. Just set up my sleeping bag on the bed, put my food in the small wooden pantry, and check the well pump to make sure I had water. The water was cold and metallic tasting, but it was fine for washing up. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills, and the light in the valley turned golden. I grabbed a beer from my cooler, sat on the porch, and watched the trees sway in the wind. It was peaceful. No cars. No voices. Just the sound of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional creak of tree branches. As it got darker, I decided to call it a night. I lit the wood stove, made myself a quick dinner of canned soup and crackers, and then got into bed with a flashlight and a book. The cabin creaked as it settled, the wood expanding and shifting with the temperature change. It was an old sound, a natural one, and I found it oddly comforting. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was dark except for a thin strip of moonlight coming through the window. The woods outside were silent, too silent. I sat up, listening. There was nothing at first. Then, just at the edge of my hearing, I thought I caught the sound of something moving outside. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the leaves. Something slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy ones. I stayed completely still. I hadn't seen any houses or campsites for miles on my way here. No one should be out here. The footsteps moved toward the cabin, crunching over dry leaves. Then they stopped, right outside the door. My heart pounded. I reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever was outside to know I was awake. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, waiting. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself to move. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. The moon was bright enough that I could see the clearing outside. There was no one there. I waited, staring at the shadows under the trees, but nothing moved.
No footsteps.
No sound. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was an animal and my half-asleep brain had turned it into something bigger. I stayed by the window for a long time, but nothing happened. Eventually, I got back into bed, though I kept the flashlight in my hand. It took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Sunlight streamed through the trees, birds were chirping, and the woods didn't seem as eerie as they had the night before. Still, I walked around the cabin, looking for footprints. I found them, large, booted prints half sunk into the damp soil. They led from the woods to the porch, and then they stopped. There were no prints leading away. I stood there, staring at them, my skin crawling. Someone had walked up to the cabin in the middle of the night, and they hadn't walked away. I spent the rest of the day on edge, listening to every sound in the woods, feeling watched. By the time the sun started to set, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bags, threw them in the truck, and drove out of that valley as fast as I could. As I reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but just before I turned the corner, I saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back, and I never went back to that cabin again. I was looking forward to a quiet weekend away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just peace. I had been working nonstop for months, and I needed a break. A buddy of mine had a family cabin deep in the woods of Montana, near a place called Silver Creek. He told me I could use it anytime, so I finally took him up on the offer. It was early October, and the weather was just starting to turn cold. The trees had already started shedding their leaves, leaving the ground covered in a thick layer of orange and brown. I packed my truck with enough supplies for a few days: food, water, a rifle just in case, and plenty of firewood. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, and once you got past a certain point, there was no cell service. That was fine with me. I wanted to be alone. The drive up was peaceful. The roads were mostly empty, and after about an hour, I left the paved highway and turned onto a dirt road. The trees grew denser the further I drove, blocking out more and more of the sky. I rolled the window down and breathed in the crisp, clean air. It smelled like pine and damp earth. After another 30 minutes of winding through the forest, I reached the turnoff for the cabin. It wasn't marked, just a barely visible path in the trees. If I hadn't known what to look for, I would have driven right past it. The truck bounced over roots and rocks as I slowly made my way down the path. Finally, the trees opened up, and there it was. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of dark, weathered logs. A single window faced the clearing, and the front porch had a couple of old chairs. The roof was covered in moss, and the chimney looked like it hadn't been used in years. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched out for miles. I parked the truck and got out, stretching my legs. It was dead silent. No wind, no birds, just stillness. I grabbed my bag and stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The key was right where my buddy said it would be, hidden under a loose board near the door. I unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open. Inside, it was simple, just a single room with a bed against one wall, a small kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. A few old hunting trophies hung on the walls, their glass eyes staring out into the room. The air was musty but not unbearable. I set my bag down and started unpacking. I spent the first couple of hours settling in, chopping firewood, and making sure everything was in working order. By the time the sun started setting, I had a fire going in the stove, and the cabin was warming up nicely. I cooked a simple meal, ate by the dim light of a lantern, and then stepped outside for a bit of fresh air. The forest was dark now, almost unnaturally so. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, but the silence was unsettling. I was used to hearing crickets or the occasional owl, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I shook off the feeling and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I read for a while, then crawled into bed, exhausted from the long drive. The fire crackled softly, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. Something moving outside. It wasn't an animal. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart started pounding. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tightly as I listened. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, I kept the rifle close as I lay back down. Just as I was about to fall asleep again, the sound came back. This time, it was closer. Something was right outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fire had died down, leaving the room in near darkness. I reached for the lantern and turned it up slightly, casting flickering light across the walls. Then, there was a soft tap on the window. I froze. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too quiet to be an animal. Someone was out there. I waited, barely breathing. The tapping came again, but I refused to move. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I listened for footsteps, but there was nothing. The silence stretched on until I finally convinced myself that whoever or whatever it was had left. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. Morning came and everything seemed normal. Sunlight streamed through the trees, and the world felt safe again. I stepped outside and looked around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the day hiking around the area, making sure I knew my surroundings. There was an old, overgrown trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while but turned back before going too far. The further I went, the heavier the air felt, like I was being watched. That night, I made sure the door was locked and the rifle was within arm's reach. I told myself it had just been my imagination. Then the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just a tap. It was a knock, a slow, deliberate knock on the front door. I sat up, gripping my rifle. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was freezing. The knock came again. I didn't move. Then the doorknob turned. The door was locked, but I heard it rattle, like someone testing it. My stomach dropped. I aimed the rifle at the door, my hands shaking. Then silence. For the next hour, I sat there, gun in hand, waiting. But nothing happened. Eventually, I dozed off, still holding the rifle. When I woke up, the door was open. Not just unlocked, wide open. Cold air poured into the cabin. My truck keys were gone. My backpack was missing, but everything else was untouched. Whoever had been there didn't want my things. They just wanted me to know they had been inside. I grabbed what I could, ran to my truck, and got out of there. I never told my friend what happened. Never asked him if anyone else had ever had an experience like that. I just know I'll never go back. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I still hear that soft tapping on the window.